tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
This is Chad Graham with Thinker Sensitive on the rise of socialism. I'm here with Ben Crenshaw, my co-host. Ben, thanks for coming here tonight and doing this episode with me. We're going to talk about Scandinavian and Nordic socialism tonight.
All right, thanks for having me on, Chad.
Kind of obscure and obtuse subject matter, but hey, this is interesting stuff to us. We're free market guys, and so we want to understand and kind of dig beneath this cultural understanding of the Scandinavian success, the Nordic success of instituting these highly socialist countries where the happiness index and the freedom index is simultaneously rising. So we're going to kind of peel back some of these layers and talk about what's happening in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. Ben, talk to us a little bit about what you see happening in the economic ordering of these countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, these countries are kind of held up as a model example in our public and civil discourse today as socialist success.
Right.
The problem is that they're not pure socialist countries. The government does not own the means of production within these countries. What ends up happening actually is that there is a massive and flourishing private sector. And this private sector is creating all the wealth of these countries. So you have all kinds of businesses that have flourished for centuries within basic market regulations and or market arrangements. And they've produced all kinds of wealth, and then the government comes along as like a leech and attaches onto the private sector and sucks all kinds of resources and
from
money
the free market,
from the market, exactly,
operating in the private sector.
And in that combined with really high taxes, like in some places 50 or 60% tax rate, really high taxes on people who are working in the private sector, and a lot of people who are working in government as well, that provides all of the government largesse, the monies by which they can fund this really massive welfare state. And so what you have here is kind of these welfare states that are socialist light. They're not really socialism.
Again, because the government isn't controlling the means of production
Exactly.
unilaterally.
These companies and individuals have a great deal of economic freedom. These countries rank very highly in the Human Freedom Index because they're given all kinds of opportunities between human rights and the freedom of movement and association and private property and so forth. So you have all kinds of market mechanisms and tenets and ideals in place and functioning, and then the government uses that to create this welfare system with a very, very large and generous social safety net.
And none of those things sound like socialism to me. We're talking about free enterprise, freedom index, things like that.
Yeah, it's really kind of just a form of government interventionism,
right,
to create a welfare state and a large safety net.
And we have to be honest about the history of these countries.
Absolutely.
Some of these countries, like Denmark, is a pioneer in free markets. They've had free market systems, free market economies, some of the strongest private banking industries, some of the oldest long-running private banking industries in the history of the world. And so this benefit or this flourishing that's taking place on top of the free market is really hard to judge right now whether or not it's going to work out. If you start to add one by one these socialist policies on a free market system, eventually it will collapse if you go too far. We can't say whether or not that's going to happen in these Scandinavian and Nordic countries. It hasn't been long enough. We don't have a long enough sample set of data to tell whether or not that next benefit or that next subsidy from the government is going to be too much for that private sector, that free market, to bear.
Exactly. Yeah, that brings to mind a really good Adam Smith quote. Adam Smith said at one point that there is a great deal of ruin in a nation. And what he meant by that is that it can take a long time for a nation that has been prosperous and successful and built up a lot of capital, and not just monetary or financial capital, but human capital, the institutions, the culture, the norms that are necessary to have a flourishing country. It can take a long time, centuries, for those kinds of successful countries to collapse.
Destabilize.
So we don't really know. Here's a good example of that. It's Sweden. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, which ended probably in the 1830s, 1840s. By the 1860s, Sweden put in place a lot of free market reforms. And these reforms led to all kinds of innovation and entrepreneurship. And this is where you have these kind of iconic Swedish businesses come into existence: Volvo, Ericsson, IKEA, and so forth. Well, this lasted until about the 1930s. Ironically, this was the same time when welfarism was implemented in the U.S. under FDR.
Yes.
So the 1930s was kind of a downer year in terms of social policy. And what Sweden did was they decided to create a welfare state, which then they expanded in the 1950s. And eventually, government spending as a percentage of GDP got up to about 50% in 1975. And this led to all kinds of economic shocks. And some of these were like a currency devaluation, inflation, rising unemployment, stagnation in production, anemic growth, until in 1992, their fixed exchange rate policy collapsed. And that was kind of the trigger of like, we cannot continue with these massive bloated welfare policies that are strangling this economy. And so what they did was they put in market reforms. They began privatizing state-owned companies. They began deregulating parts of the economy, scaling back the welfare state. They got rid of the inheritance tax, the wealth tax, all kinds of things. Opened up a competitive voucher system. And what happened was the Swedish economy rebounded.
But Sweden's socialist.
Oh, yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Right, yeah.
And so even though, and catch this point, the point here, there's 2 points. These market reforms, which led to a revitalization of Sweden, did lead to greater material inequality between different people. But that's a good trade-off. If that inequality comes about in just and fair ways, because we're treating people equally under the rule of law, and because people are different, they have a tendency to produce different amounts of wealth. Then, and if it leads to a growing economy and human economic freedom and prosperity and so forth, that's absolutely acceptable.
Right.
The other critical,
And it sounds like benefits of free markets, not
oh
the
yeah,
converse,
absolutely.
you know?
And this is and that's the other critical point, is that when you actually look at time series data throughout the history of a country, instead of just a one time frame country to country, cross-sectional comparison, if you look at a time series data, you'll see how these countries evolved, how they rose in their freedom and their prosperity when they had market reforms. And then all that went downhill with the advent of socialist welfarism, and then it came back with the advent of markets. And so when you look at the history of this, it's just the trend lines are extremely clear. So just don't be bedeviled by these popular talking heads who, just kind of throw out one of these Nordic or Scandinavian countries and compare them to the United States.
Right. Well, that brings up another point. I think we really have to address this. It's really hard to compare Scandinavian and Nordic countries to a super economy like the United States of America, where we have 300 plus million people. We've got a workforce that is only really rivaled by China and sometimes India, depending on the interpretation of the economic data. How and should we compare Scandinavian and Nordic countries to a super economy like the United States?
Yeah, I don't really think there's any way to compare it at all. We can talk about a couple of different things. First of all, the size of these nations are tiny, very small. Like
Give us the list.
Yeah, the Scandinavian countries, like Denmark is 5.7 million people, Norway 5.3 million people, Sweden 1.10 million. The Nordic countries, Finland is 5.5 million, Iceland's less than 500,000, and then you have even something like New Zealand is less than 5 million people.
So the biggest one is Sweden at 10 million?
Yeah, basically the size of New York City.
Right.
So, these are teeny tiny countries, and because they have a small population, and that population has a historical lineage, they're monolithic.
Yeah.
They have a
homogenous culture.
Exactly, a homogenous culture and people with a common values, common norms, common history. Now, America, by contrast, is much different.
Right.
We have people from all over the world, we began as a country, colonies for those who were religiously persecuted, for those who were seeking economic gain, for people of all different kinds of Protestant denominations. And then, of course, we've opened our doors to people of other religions. We have all kinds of cultures. Sometimes it's talked about as a melting pot, sometimes a tossed salad. Better a melting pot because there's some kind of common ground there.
Right.
But America is unique in the world history.
Right.
And so we're really comparing apples and oranges. And it's a bad comparison. And that's why I say we should go back to time series data and look at these countries across their own history.
And we're relatively young by world standards.
Absolutely.
We're a young country. We're fledgling. We're still developing. We're still turning around in terms of our culture. So, when I hear about these population indexes and the homogenous cultures, really, and the lack of evidence that these countries are actually socialist, I think that's really our starting point. Do these countries and their governments and their economies operate in such a way that the government controls the means of production? Well, no. They allow these incredibly free markets that allow the private sector to flourish and thrive, and then they institute a number of socialist policies, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, they're kind of socialist-like.
They're voluntary.
Right.
They have democratic systems in place to bring about these policies. And so really, they're small enough, they're homogeneous enough, they're monolithic, and so they can bring about and build consensus in a way that a country like America, you try to get people from Boston and Wyoming to agree on how we ought to run social welfare systems.
Let alone California.
Let alone the oddball California out there. We're just very, very different.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to be governed different.
Yeah, America is full of different cultures.
Yeah.
You have all kinds of subcultures and different cultures, and it's literally like taking a bunch of different nations and just smushing them all together.
Yes.
And asking them to create this kind of homogenous culture, economic and policy arrangements. And it's just not going to work. It's going to blow up in our face if we attempt it.
So I tend to reject the comparisons. I think it's okay to look at some of these Scandinavian and Nordic countries as models, as ways for us to kind of look and see how this cashes out over time. Just how much can we put on the government in terms of providing subsidy in these number of ways while still maintaining a very free and prosperous market. That sounds leagues away from democratic socialism, where we start to turn over our industries, turn over our board members of our major corporations, like Elizabeth Warren is now proposing, to allow the government to oversee the means of production.
Absolutely.
So I reject it.
Yeah, it's a bad comparison. It's a misunderstanding of these countries and how they got to where they are today. If you look at the closer these countries approximate the socialist ideal of complete egalitarianism, wealth just redistribution, the poorer they become, the greater they go into debt, the more crisis there is, and then there's talk of austerity, and they've got to pull back from the brink. So they're not even close to being socialists.
And Jordan Sutton, I know that you always comment with New Zealand on my page. Let me drop some truth bombs on you for a second. The population of New Zealand is 4.9 million people. It's an island that's relatively isolated from the rest of the world, so they're not really under threat of a mass migration issue that's going to cause the cultural issues that we have to deal with day in and day out. So I'm thrilled that their socialist policies are working there. I still think it operates much like these Nordic and Scandinavian countries, where there has been the Britain influence from Australia and other Western European countries that have infused free market systems, and now they've achieved a level of prosperity and natural resources in their exports and imports where they can handle the government subsidy programs, but they are not comparable to the United States of America. Jordan, I love you, buddy. This is Chad Graham and Ben Crenshaw for Thinker Sensitive, The Rise of Socialism. Check out our other policy episodes on universal basic income, universal health care, free college tuition, and also another explainer episode on Christianity and socialism. Ben, thanks.
Thank you, Chad.
For more Thinker Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com. Be sure to find us on iTunes and YouTube as well.